Scenes from the trailer for a new CBC podcast that launches today. Archival footage you see as well. You're going to see in this trailer someone you know very well from covering the news for us at CBC and going to be the host of something called Kuper Island, an 8-part podcast that looks at what transpired in one of the most notorious of the residential schools in Canada. It was known as Canada's Alcatraz, in fact, as I'm learning, by the time it closed in 1975. So there are pictures of Kuper Island. And with me this morning to tell us about the podcast is the man behind it. That is Duncan McCue. I'm so glad to have you with us this morning, Duncan. Thanks for coming back.
Good morning, Ada.
We were talking about this, if people remember, if watch us regularly, when we were in following the Indigenous delegations visiting the Pope, and you were saying that you were working on something very special. It launches today. Tell us about Kuper Island.
Yeah, Heather, cast your mind back for a second to last summer when we began to hear about unmarked graves at residential schools, and it just seemed like Indigenous community after Indigenous community were announcing that there were unmarked graves at the residential schools, former residential schools in their communities as well, and it was almost hard to keep up. There was so much hurt and pain from the Indigenous community, shock from Canadians who had not heard this history. But one announcement caught my eye. Penelakut, the community of Penelakut, announced that there were unmarked graves at the former Kuper Island residential school. I'd been a reporter in BC for nearly 2 decades and reporting on residential schools, and I had heard a lot of bad things, Heather, about Kuper Island. As you mentioned, this is a place that was notorious. In the first 3 decades of its existence, nearly 40% of the children died. 4 out of 10 children who attended that school died. It was a place that children were trying to run away from, and that's nothing new. I mean, children were running away from residential schools, from every residential school right across the country. But as you can see in the pictures there, I mean, this was a place that was on an island in the Salish Sea, and yet children were still trying to get away from there, and you have to ask yourself why, and I thought this is an important story that needs to be told.
And so you tell us the story in the 8 parts of your podcast, and you've mentioned on numerous moments there in just in that first answer, children. There you are arriving in the footage, but children. It is through the stories of children that we're going to learn what happened. Tell us about Tony and James and Belvie and Richard.
Last summer when we embarked on this, we didn't, I'm an Indigenous journalist, and I didn't want to cause any more pain for survivors than already existed. So producers Jody Martinson and Martha Troyan and I approached the Penelakut Elders Committee to ask if they were okay with us, coming back repeatedly to the community and asking about deaths and the high rates of abuse that happened at Kuper Island. 2 members of the Penelakut Elders Committee, Tony and James Charlie, really wanted to share their story, and so they're a key part of this podcast. In walking around the old school grounds with them, I learned about the death of a boy, Richard Thomas, who, it's a tragic death. It's a death that's a mystery still to many of the survivors. They whispered about it for years, and that led us to Belvie Breber, who was Richard's brother, and we began to learn more about the circumstances of his death, but also who he was as a boy, and that was really important to us. We wanted to go beyond the cold, hard numbers of the deaths and try to help Canadians understand that these were children who had families and they never came home. And that, this isn't a thing of the past, Heather. This has impacted generations, and it's impacted families. And Belvie Breber is still wondering what happened to her brother Richard, and we hope to try to give her some answers.
So the investigation is part of the storyline as well. As I remember back to April the 1st when we talked about this, and you said you were immersed in the writing process, and I could tell at that time, the writing was having an effect on you. At the end of the process of putting this all together, how do you think this has touched you, Duncan?
This hasn't been an easy project, Heather. It hasn't. As an Indigenous reporter, I really wanted to make sure that we honored the stories of the survivors, and as I say, didn't hurt anybody. And so being trauma informed, I mean, it sounds like cliche, well, not cliche, but you know, I just tried to do my best to be transparent, so that they feel that we're bearing witness to their story, which I think is important, but we're not doing any more harm. And likewise for our team, I mean, Martha and Jody and I, we've been through some dark moments in the past months as we learned about the incredible amount of sexual assault in particular at the school, and the fact that this was covered up. It was covered up in 1939, it was covered up in the 1960s, and that's disturbing to find out. It hasn't been easy, but I do hope that people who listen to the podcast will learn something about their country, and will take away the courage of not only the survivors who are sharing their story, but the non-Indigenous Canadians who stood up and in 1939, when it was a police officer who said, there's something wrong here. The kids aren't running away because they don't like the place. There's something fundamentally wrong with this, and investigated and found multiple accusations of sexual assault, and yet nothing was done. I hope that Canadians take away the courage that it takes to break the silence.
Duncan, thank you for the time with us this morning. Really appreciate it. The first episode is available today, 8 all told. Duncan McCue, the host of all of that, and someone who has invested, obviously, tremendously into telling this difficult subject matter, but important to hear. So Kuper Island, beginning today, 8 episodes released weekly, and you can find it on CBC Listen or wherever you go to get your podcasts.